For this tutorial, I want to demonstrate a method for being able to create an old weathered shingled roof like this one that would be appropriate for a medieval house. So in this we are going to use a cloner, bump map, a displacer, and a connect object in order to get this kind of look. So let's begin. So what I'm going to start out with here is just a very simple Monopoly style house, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here with this, but we'll build out our very simple house. Display will be constant shading with lines, and we'll put a single segment on the Z, make it editable, select the edge, and simply pull it up for a very simple house. Okay. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing all right, because R21, which is what I'm using here, has changed the interface colors, and in my opinion they're not very good. They make it difficult to see elements like edges and points and a variety of things, but I haven't been able to change the color effectively to what I want, so we'll just live with what we've got here. So I'm going to call this cube the house. Now on this house I'm going to create one half of the roof at a time, and then I'm going to work on one half of the roof. I'm just going to delete the other half and then mirror it over once I get it finished. So I'm just going to delete that, select this, and split it off. So I got a roof there. With the house, we're just going to delete that, the roof, because I don't need it. And then I'm going to create some overhang here. So I'm just going to pull some eaves, select that edge there, and pull down eave there. So I got a certain amount of overlap. Nothing on the top, of course. So just see they got some overlaps there. Then I'm going to hide the house because I don't need to really see that any longer. Now I'm going to create thickness to the roof. I'm going to rename this roof. Give it some thickness using the extrude tool, and that'll be the thickness of the roof beams. When you use the extrude tool like this, it leaves a hollow area on the back. So while that tool is still active, just click in the properties and say create caps. And that'll fill in that space on the back. Now you have to deliberately click on live select to drop that tool, or the cap will disappear for whatever reason. Okay, so now this is our roof. Now before I continue, I want to reconstruct a little bit, realign some of the vertices on the roof, because if I mirror this over, I don't want to have this angle at the top. So I'm going to go to my right view, and I've activated here the constant shading with lines, because normally I'd use wireframe and lines, but you can see it's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to go with constant shading with lines. I'm not quite sure why Cinema or why Maxon has done that, but I'm going to grab those vertices there, and I want to align them vertically here with this vertex down there. So I'm going to pull on this widget right here and pull it up so that it aligns with that green axis. Then notice the white line. You can see that white line that extrudes out. If I line that up with my edge, then I've kept it nice and consistent, and drop that. And so now when I mirror, it'll mirror over to the other side. So like this, select the mirror tool, make sure that the coordinate system is screen. Then I'm going to click out here on one side of my workspace. That'll create that white preview line. I'll just want to click here and align that right up with my angle on my roof and let go, and then I've got my mirrored object. Okay, so I don't want to do that right now. I'll do that later after I get everything done. But conversely, if I click on this side, then I get the same kind of a situation. And wherever I drop it, that's where the mirror will take place. If I click above the midpoint, then it'll be a horizontal mirror, okay, like that. So that's how the mirror tool works. All right, so now what we need to do is create a couple of shingles that we can clone in order to create our collection of shingles. So I'm just going to use a cubic object here and shape it to the way I want a shingle. Now normally you'd make a shingle pretty thin, but when you do that, the displacer object that we'll use later on tends to displace the back side of the shingle onto the front side, and so we don't want that. So I'm going to make it a little thicker than I normally would. Then I'm going to shape it up here, trying to keep it in a somewhat consistent proportion to the roof, although quite frankly I'm going to make it a little bit bigger than what normally I would make a shingle. And the reason for that is because we're going to end up with quite a bit of geometry here with these shingles by the time I'm done. And if your computer's not up to it, then everything will slow down a whole lot. So I'm going to make the shingles a little bit bigger than I typically would. And you can adjust this, as you for your own particular scene, but make it a little bit bigger than I normally would just for the sake of saving some geometry. Now I'm going to add, I don't want just a regular rectangle here. I want something that looks kind of raggedy. And so I'm going to add some segments in the X. Give me some geometry to work with here, and I think I'll go with 8. Should work fairly well. Don't need any in the Z, of course, but I am going to add one in the Y. And then make my shingle editable. I'm going to take that edge that I created there and just move it down. And just move it down toward the bottom. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to create some splits in the bottom here in order to make it look more old and weathered, and so that's going to be where that split will reach. Okay, so now what I want to do, I'm going to duplicate this, and so you want to create 4 or 5 of these. Just control drag. And the reason for that is that you want variation in these shingles. Don't want to too repetitive, and so you want some variation. Now this takes a little bit of time to do, but it will give you a better result by the time you're finished. So now you can simply go in and begin to change the description of that lower edge, and just go through each one and make them a little bit different. You don't want to get too crazy with with the deformation here, you can let the displacer object do some of that for you. So keep it somewhat restrained, just so the bottom side has some variety to it. And that's up to you to decide how you want to do that. It's a little tedious having to go through this process, but in the long run, it'll end up giving you a nicer look. And you can play around with your own designs, of course, to come up with something that you think works well for you. Now, something that I also want to do, as I mentioned earlier, is I want to split. Get some splits in the bottoms here so it feels like, you know, they're old and really have weathered and splintered and looking pretty raggedy. So I'm going to go up here to my perspective view, hide that roof, don't need to see it right now. Get into my shingles here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some splits here. So I'm going to use the bridge tool to create an opening. So the bridge tool, get it to work. Sometimes the bridge tool is a little finicky. And you just keep clicking until you find the right combination. Get rid of that, so I got an opening here. So that gives me a split. But I don't want it to be just a squared off split like that, so I'm going to go in and select some of those edges and manipulate them around. Maybe drag one down a little bit further, just to give some variation. And again, they don't all need to have splits in them, but you do want, so you want to create some variety. So use your own judgment to decide how you want to do it. I'm just going to do that same thing. Okay, drop that tool. Delete those polygons there. Now again, don't want to have them be too consistent, so I'll try to vary my shapes. Yeah, he did it with only one go that time. I don't want to have them all tall openings, and so again, just kind of use your own judgment to decide if you want some to be really tall, and just experiment with these things and get the kind of look that you want. Just get a variety of shapes there. Okay, so there's my shingles. That'll be good enough, I think. We'll just go with that to see what we get. I'm going to child those to a cloner. So just going to grab all of them and drop them onto a cloner. Now, cloner, the other thing you want to make sure is check each one. Make sure that the axis is centered on each one. Otherwise, your clones will not be lined up the way that you expect them to be. So just make sure they're lined up. And if they're not, let's say, for example, this one was off there somewhere like that. So when I click on that, you can see it's not centered. So if you need to center them, just select the object, then go to Mesh, Axis, Axis Center, and then just leave everything, all the settings set at default, and then just click Execute. And that'll put it back in the center again. Okay, so once you've done that, now we've got these lined up in this typical linear arrangement, which we don't want. So go to Cloner, Object, Mode, and change Linear to Honeycomb Array. And you can scroll back and you see what Honeycomb Array does there. It creates a grid of offset objects, kind of like a brick type pattern. So now we need to rearrange that in terms of size and width in order to get it lined up in the way that we can use. So with our, don't worry about the count yet, we'll add the count once we bring our roof back. Meanwhile, let's go with size width and size height. So this width, 300 centimeters by default. Let's bring those in close to begin with. That's good enough to start out with. In the same way, now if you know anything about shingles, you know they have to overlap each other. The one above overlapping the one below. Otherwise, it's not going to keep the rain out of the house. So we need to change the size height so that they overlap like that. So we got overlapping here. Okay. Now we need them to get a lot closer together, of course. So your tendency is to reduce the size of width until they're right up close to each other like that. Now we want our offset direction to not be height. We want the offset direction determines which portion of the honeycomb is lined up, is aligned. We'd rather have our edges aligned here and our bottom part raggedy, offset. So let's change that to offset direction width. Okay, so now we've got our offset direction. We've got them overlapped vertically. But now in terms of horizontally, you don't want to bring them in like this and line them up, because that's not going to keep the rain from going into the house. You can't have these aligned grooves here, and so you have to get this edge and this edge next to each other. So just keep pulling those in until they get like that. And zoom in closer so you can see the gap. You can leave a little bit of gap. You don't want them to overlap horizontally here. Get them to butt up against one another there. So you can leave a little bit of gap between them, like that. Except I forgot one important element, and that is beveled edges. So I'm going to drag those out of my cloner for the time being. And I'm going to go back and bevel my edges. So of course you want to do this to begin with. Give them a little bit of bevel there. 2 subdivisions. That'll be good enough. Take those, put them all back in the cloner again. Okay, so we've got our shingles all lined up here. But the trouble is they're lined up, and so you don't want them all lined up like this. You want the top ones to be overlapping the bottom ones. So go to the cloner. You can kind of look at the side view here to see what's happening. So go to cloner, transform, and then go down to the transform section. R.P is the one that you want, and then add a minus degree, and you can see what that does. So it angles them like this, and so you want to angle them in such a way that they are, you can have a little bit of gap there, but pretty much lined up like that. Okay, now if you want to see what that looks like, just go ahead and activate your interactive render. And you get that kind of look. Okay, so good enough to begin with. Okay, now let's bring our roof back so we can align it with our roof. Go to a side view here, and with the cloner selected so you can move them all at once, go ahead and line those up with the roof. So obviously you need to rotate them so that they align with the angle of the roof, and move tool to move them so that they touch the roof, and try to get them aligned here so that these lower portions touch the roof. You can see I need to rotate it just a little bit more there. Doesn't have to be overly picky with it, but okay, so now we need to get it to cover the roof. In order to do that, to go to the cloner again, object, and you want to go to the count width and count height. So count width, you just add enough there to cover the roof. Now the thing that you want to do is look at your perspective view, kind of orbit around here and take a look at underneath. So you get the shingles overlapping the roof just a little bit. Okay, it doesn't have to be too much, but typically they don't line up exactly on the roof. Even modern shingles don't do that. Okay, and so if you need to, you can go in and make adjustments. In order to get these all to align correctly, you can go ahead and make adjustments to the count, height and width, but also the size, height and width, especially size and width. You can make adjustments there, or you can go in and actually change the scale a little bit of your cubes, prototype cubes, just so that you get them lined up correctly on the roof. Now in terms of count height, again, you want to take a look at what's going on underneath so that you get some overlap here. And basically you don't want a lot of overlap up here, but this is too much overlap on the bottom here, so you might want to see if you go one less with that height, maybe that is better. Maybe you can go even one less here, so you get about that amount of overlap, but you don't want to have a gap up on the top, so you need to bring the top up to right there now, and now we need maybe a little bit more overlap on the bottom. So it's just a matter of tweaking these things until you can get it just the way that you want. So we're going to leave a little bit overlap there on the bottom, and this amount of overlap on the top is okay, because we'll just come back and trim that off later. Okay, so now we got our basic alignment. Got a roof there. Let's take a look at it, interactive render. And you see a pretty good variation. Now if you want to go to the cloner, instead of doing clones iterate, if you do clone random, it'll randomize those shingles even more. So we get a nice kind of random distribution. Now of course right now they're too smooth. You need to jumble them up a little bit here in order to make it look correct. So if you, like me, don't like these white cloners, you can always just add a little bit of color here so that it turns them gray, which is better, in my opinion, than that bright white. We'll add a material to the shingles later in order to get the final look to the shingle. All right, now what we need to do is to make all of these cubes, these shingles, as unique elements, meshes. So in order to do that, we're going to child the cloner to Connect Object. So here into the surface menu, Connect Object, click Connect. You'll see now the cloner is a child of the Connect Object. You'll see that it'll change the appearance here just a little bit because the Connect Object changes some things, especially the Phong value, and we need to change that back, but we'll do that in a minute. What the Connect Object does is to take all those cloned objects, makes them into a single object with as many meshes as have been created here, which is a lot. Takes all those meshes and makes them into a single object. They're still individual meshes, but they're a single object now. So to get access to them as polygons, let's right-click on the Connect Object and do Current State to Object. And remember to hide that Connect Object so it doesn't get in the way of what you're doing after this. Change that Connect name to Shingle. Okay. And now here, when you've done that, notice that you've got a new object in your Object Manager, and it has these gold spheres or dots in the tagline. That's the Phong value, so click on it, and you can see that the Connect Object has changed the Phong Angle to 180 degrees. That's what's rounding these off. Phong Angle is a mathematical algorithm that smooths or sharpens edges. So the default angle is 40 degrees. The Connect Object changed that angle to 180 for some reason. So let's change it back to 40 and just see what happens in our interactive render. You can see it's flattened it more. Still too rounded though, looks like drops of liquid dripping down off the roof there. So let's take it down even further. Let's take it down to 20 degrees. Okay, so now we got our flatness back, which is what we want. Now be aware you have a lot of geometry here now, and so be aware that your computer is going to go slower. And if you find that it's going too slow, then don't put so many subdivisions in your original shingles, and then you won't have so much geometry. You won't have as good an effect when you child the displacer object to the shingle, but you have to do what you have to do. All right, so now what we're going to do to get some displacement on here is that we're going to take our shingle. So we've just got a single object, but that single object is made up of all of these shingles. Every one of these shingles is a separate mesh. So let's go ahead and make the shingles a parent of the displacer object. Now you'll notice that nothing happens here because you need to add some parameters to the displacer. So click on the displacer, go to its object. You'll see the strength is 100% and the height is 10 centimeters. Now that's default, just leave that at default for right now. Click on shading, then go down to the shader, open that up and add a noise to it. The displacer needs to have a noise channel in order to displace the polygons. So that's what's happening here when we add this displacer, is that it is displacing the polygons in those shingles. So let's do that and see what happens. It gets pretty radical there. So obviously too strong. So we'll go back to the object, and you got strength and height. So change the height from 10 centimeters. This will be determined by the scale of your scene, but experiment and find out what works. So let's go with half that size. Okay, so that's better. Okay. So play around with the strength, maybe reduce the strength a little. So we get some deformation here, but maybe we want to have it a little bit more dramatic than that. So let's go ahead and pump the height back up, say to 8 centimeters. Let's go ahead and try 10 and see what happens. Okay, it doesn't look too bad. Again, the more of this that you add to your scene, the slower your refresh is going to take. So you just have to adjust things as needed. So if we put that up to, I don't know, just try 15, see what it does. Well, that's probably a little bit too dramatic. So again, just experiment, find out what works best for you. Okay, so now let's add a material to this. So I've already got some materials down here, but I'll just make a new one. So we're going to add this. This is going to be our shingle. And we'll add it to our shingle. No, don't add it to the displacer, but add it to the shingle. Okay. Make it cubic mapping. Double click to get to its parameters. Reflections channel. Remove that default specular. Add a Beckman. And just go through this process that you know about already. Add a lot of roughness so that we get kind of a matte surface, and then the strength of it, reduce that down to something really small, because you don't want your roof to be either reflective nor shiny. Maybe you want to catch just a little bit of specular on the edges of those shingles, which is why we beveled them, but don't want it to be shiny or glossy. Okay. Now the color, I'd recommend that you adjust the color to be something more akin to a clay model, a grayscale type model. So get a gray value going there, and then go to the basic channel and add, or basic tab, and add a bump channel. Go to bump and just add a noise. What we're going to try to simulate here is a grain, old weathered grain on the surface of the shingles. So obviously that doesn't work. So once you've added that, then go to the noise parameters and change noise from noise to blistered turbulence. Works pretty well. And then adjust its relative scale. So what we don't want these bumpy kind of distribution. We want it to be streaks. So go in and change the streak. You want to be vertical. So change Y to 500%, let's say. That gives you streaks this way, and squeeze them closer together. So X, maybe 50%. Okay, so now you're starting to get kind of a grain running along the length of the shingles. And you can go back and step back and increase the strength here to get the kind of look that you want. And so you go in and play around with those parameters until you can get the look that you want. Like I say, you have to be patient as your computer updates things, because you've got more and more math that has to be calculated here to get this to all work together. Now, I think we need to add some ambient occlusion to this to define the edges better. And maybe drop a light in here. So, I've got a light already, so I don't need to worry about that. I've already got that light in there. So I've got both a key light and a fill light already in the scene. But let's add some ambient occlusion. Now when you add ambient occlusion from the render settings up here, it adds it globally to everything in the scene. And you know that slows calculations down when everything has ambient occlusion added to it. So if you want to restrict the ambient occlusion to only specific things, you can add it to the color channel of the material that's been added to those things. So we'll go to the shingle, double click on it to get to its properties, click on color, click on texture, open that up, and click on effects, ambient occlusion. Now what this does is add ambient occlusion just to the roof, to nothing else, to the shingles here, and you can see the edges now are much better defined. Now don't worry about this one up here. We're going to trim that off, and then you're going to put a ridge pole on there to cover up some of that. Plus you can also go up there and manipulate it individually, because they're all individual polygons now. So, but that brightens up the roof, and so go down to the mix mode for the color channel. Go down to mix mode and open that up and say multiply. That'll bring us back to our gray, but leaves us with defined edges. The crevices and so forth are better defined. So that's the basis for doing this, and you can just play around with the variations of it to find out what works best for you. But to finish this off, we need to trim it up a little bit. It's going to turn off my interactive render here. We can see that we've got some nice overlap here on either edge and on the bottom. But if you needed to say your bottom projected out too far, and you needed to change that relationship so it didn't stick out so far, or whatever, or you needed it to come out a little bit further, you could go to your side view, okay, select your shingles, and then with your marquee select tool, make sure that only select visible elements is unchecked, and make sure that tolerant selection is checked. So now whatever your marquee touches will be selected. So even though I only drew the marquee around the bottom part here, it's selected all the way up to the top. So you see there. So everything, when you have tolerant selection checked, which is not the default, but when it's checked, then everything that the marquee touches will be selected. And of course, if it hasn't selected everything, then you can always do UY a couple of times just to make sure that it's all selected. Now if you need to move it, you could move all those just as individual polygons to wherever you wanted them. So check in the bottom here, get as much overlap as you wanted it to have. And you can do the same thing on the top as well. However, what is probably easiest here is just to cut off this, to trim off the top of this. So the way I'm going to do that is to go to my side view. And again, if you need to adjust the rotation or whatever, just select your shingle, because that's now the thing that controls all the shingles. And you just realign your shingles there so that they just lie a line on your roof correctly. Now what I want to do is trim this overlap here off. So I don't have any edges there that I can use. So I'm just going to use my knife tool in plane cut mode. Let's activate my shingle there. Make sure I've got a component mode active and draw a plane through there. Drop that. Now as you can see, I've just created a plane right here. So now I can just draw my marquee around those, and because I have tolerant selection active, I got them all, and just delete them. So now I got the top trimmed off, okay? So now, if I'm satisfied with what I've got there, let's do an interactive render here, see what it looks like. Okay, this is still awfully long up here, but we're going to put a ridge pole on here, which will cover up about half of it. So We can live with that. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and mirror what we have. You want to mirror the roof and the shingles. So I'm going to mirror the roof first. So select that in a component mode. Right click, select mirror, click out here in an empty space, drag your preview line right up to where the edge of that is, let go and drop the tool. Now it's mirrored. Now let's do it to the shingles. So again, same setup. Right click, mirror mode, click out here in empty space, right up to the edge of the shingles, let go, drop the tool, go back to my perspective view, and there I've got shingles on both sides now. Okay, so once you've spent the time to design one side, then you've got the other side really quickly. So there's the roof, shingles for you. Now, if you look at your references, you'll see that the shingles are not all neatly lined up, and some of them are missing, and some of them are skewed, and that sort of thing. And you can do that easily now. Just activate your shingle object here. Go to your polygon mode, and then each one of these is just now activate move, so that you can just double click on a part, and you've got each one of these is an individual mesh, so you can move that around as you like. Maybe you just want to get rid of it, right? Just to get some variation. Maybe you want to get one and rotate it a bit, just so it's going a different direction. Maybe one of these down here, just delete one of those. And then just check with your interactive render occasionally to see how it's looking. And you can go in and make adjustments to any of them that you like. You can play around with getting variations on your shingles. Get some of them skewed. Okay. Maybe one of them down here. I want to pull that one down a little bit further. One in here. You want to pull that one up a little bit further. You just go in and make some adjustments and come to make your roof look more organic, more weathered and used and old. Okay, now the next thing that we want to do here is that I'm going to put a ridge pole on here. The ridge pole is that element that runs through the top of a roof. That's going to be a wooden beam here to cover up the top of this. So we're going to go to my front or my right view for that. Create a cube. Going to put it in the center there to get it started. Scale it down to something about like that. You'll just have to play around with this to experiment. Okay, now we don't want it squared up like this, so we need to rotate that 45 degrees, like that. And then what I'm going to do is make a chevron or an upside down V shape out of this. So in order to be able to do that easily, I'm going to add segments in the Y and the Z. Yeah, so we got these two segments here. Okay. Now I can change those. Those are too thick, probably. I'll make it editable. Then you can select those and make them a little thinner like that. Because those are going to be the edges that cover over the top of your roof here. But of course we don't want them in a square. We want them to be like an upside down V. So let's first of all bring this thing out here so we can actually see it. And the easiest way to do this is just activate your vertex mode. Select those two vertices, right click, weld that one up there. Select those, weld that one there, and there you've got it. Okay, now you just need to position it over your roof where you want it to go. So in model mode, put it there, activate my vertex, select those vertices, and just drag them down over the edge of the roof. Make them longer than the roof is, so they don't perfectly line up. Okay. And bevel the edges. As usual, so we're going to go all around beveling the edges here. Okay, I'm going to bevel those. I'm going to add a little bit more bevel than for other objects, just because these are big, heavy beams. And that'll do for the time being. So there's my ridge pole. Now it needs to be repositioned, of course, so that it sits properly on the roof. And I need to have a material that's going to be similar color. So I'll just add that to the roof, but obviously the striations are going the wrong direction on it. So if we cubic mapping, this is the ridge pole here. I'll go to the bump map. And let's see if we can reorient this. Let's go 1000% on the X. Really stretch it out there. So these roofs on these old medieval houses, of course, are typically saggy. So we're going to sag this. So let's hide the shingles first. Go to the roof. I need to add some subdivisions here. So knife tool in loop mode. We'll add some subdivisions like that. Okay, so we've cut that. Now we child an FFD to this. Fit to parent. Select those vertices and sag it. There we go. So we got a nice sag. Don't overdo it, right? But add some sag to it. And then current state to object. So there's our roof. Now we bring our shingles back. And we do the same thing to the shingles. So, okay, so we're going to child an FFD to this. Do that wrong every time. Child an FFD to our shingles. Fit to parent as well as you can. Again, you want to have the same sag on the shingles. So sag those down. You probably could do both of those at the same time, but that works fine. Now with the displacer, the FFD, and everything set together there, I'm going to do a current state to object. Hide that. And that now becomes my shingles. And they're sagging nicely. Now you need to do the same thing to the ridge pole. Bring the ridge pole back. So now what you need to do is sag it also. So I'm going to cut some loops in there. Drop that. Now I could use the FFD here, but that ends up being too regular, so I'm just going to grab vertices and just drag them down so I can get a little bit of randomness to the way they look. And again, if you've ever seen old medieval houses, you know how kind of random the elements are. So now you can go to the front and line those up there so that it sits fairly nicely on the roof. And then do interactive render and just make sure everything is kind of lined up correctly. And basically there you go. Put your house back in there. Adjust materials so that all the materials are the same kind of gray scale color. So there you go. So I hope that helps.